Hi there, Shane and Caitlin here, and welcome to Science on the Table.
The podcast that covers all things South African science, where we take the tough stuff and break it down into bite-sized bits so you don't have to.
That's right, from soup to nuts. So let's lay it all out on the table.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of any affiliated institutions or organizations. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, the content shared is for general informational purposes only and should not be construed as professional advice. Some information may become outdated as new research emerges. Always consult primary sources or professionals for advice related to your field of interest. The hosts are not liable for any errors or omissions in the content, and listeners should critically evaluate the information presented.
Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Science on the Table. Today we are speaking to Dr. Thabo Hamiwe. She is a microbiologist like myself. We actually studied together and we became very good friends, but we kind of specialized in different directions or subfields of microbiology. Welcome, Thabo. Nice to have you on the podcast. We are very excited for what's lying ahead, a very thorough and informative discussion. And today you are going to tell us all about antimicrobial resistance. So once again, welcome to today, and we're very glad to have you.
Hi, Shane, and hi, Caitlin. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very excited to speak to you guys today about AMR, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us, Thabo. We want to start with a little bit of an introduction, if you don't mind. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into your field, what you're currently doing? Give us a little bit of a background, and then if you don't mind, helping our listeners, if they would be interested in going into your kind of field, what pathways they would need to take.
So having been raised in like your typical African family in the 90s, I was raised basically to get into medicine and be a doctor, because that was literally the path that a lot of parents saw for their children who were strong at science. But unfortunately, my maths wasn't as strong at the time. So I didn't manage to get into pre-med, but I did manage to get into like a BSc in biological sciences at the University of Pretoria. I think it was like the second semester of my first year of the degree that we got like our first microbiology lecture. And I really, really enjoyed it. I'd never heard of microbiology before. I never knew anybody really who did microbiology. So it was one of those love at first sight moments when I got to experience microbiology for the first time. So then soon after that, I changed my major from my general microbiological sciences to microbiology. So I did my undergrad at the University of Pretoria in general microbiology. And then I worked for 2 years at a diagnostic lab in Botswana, where I'm from. And then I came back and did my postgraduate studies. So I did everything at the Faculty of Health Sciences in medical microbiology, because I've always been more passionate about infectious diseases in humans.
Thanks, Thabo. That gives us a good idea of how you fell in love with microbiology. And I think it's also important to remember, maybe for younger people, younger students, that you learn that as you go along. Your life journey and your professional journey is that it's not necessarily a linear one, and that it's okay, if you want to change your career path or your career prospects or whatever that might be, because your needs and your interests change as time goes on. So thanks for that, and we're going to hop straight into our little chat on antimicrobial resistance. And for the listeners, that's abbreviated or acronymated as AMR. So first things first, if you can maybe tell us what is an antibiotic and what type of microorganisms do we treat with them? Do we use antibiotics for parasites, viruses, bacteria, or are they restricted to what we can treat with them?
So antibiotics or antimicrobials is basically medicine that's used to treat microbial infections. So microbial infections are infections that are caused by bacteria, viruses, or fungi. So typically an antimicrobial for bacterial infections would be known as antibiotics. For viral infections, antivirals, and for fungi would be an antifungal.
Thanks for breaking that down and specifying that an antimicrobial is for microbes, generally speaking, but specifically an antibiotic is specifically used for bacteria. So do they always work for these types of bacteria? I suppose that's what leads us into this discussion. Or do these microbes or bacteria find smarter ways to escape them?
So generally, most of them do work for microbial infections, but we are seeing trends where resistance occurs. So when it comes to treatment, it's not just a one-way process. So we do use these antimicrobials to treat our infections, but bacteria also, remember, are living things that also want to survive and also want to proliferate. So they also find ways of overcoming treatment with antimicrobials, such as antibiotics, in order to overcome being killed or to persist in the infection that they cause.
Thank you, Thabo. Can you tell us why antimicrobial resistance is such a global health concern at the moment?
Antimicrobial resistance has been linked to multiple deaths in South Africa, in Africa, and across the world. So it's such a major issue that both the WHO, the World Health Organization, and the World Bank have recognized the importance of antimicrobial resistance to human health and the economy. So in 2019, the WHO reported that over 1 million deaths could be directly attributed to AMR, and almost 5 million deaths have been found, that AMR has been found to be a contributing factor. So like I said, so it's not just the healthcare aspect that was recognized by the WHO, but the World Bank as well has found that antimicrobial resistance does also affect the economy, because at the end of the day, you need healthy people in order for you to have a robust economy. So it was found that AMR could cause up to $1 trillion in healthcare costs by 2050, and 1 to 3 trillion GDP losses per year by 2030, which is just around the corner.
But Thabo, how did we get to this point of antimicrobial resistance and the huge scale of antimicrobial resistance that we're dealing with? Because I know there's a lot of investment in antimicrobial research and for new different treatments, and to obviously get patients treated and to ensure that we don't get to the point where we have a patient or a human being actually with an infection that can't be treated at all because the bacterium or the pathogen is completely resistant to all the treatment options that are available. But maybe if you can speak specifically to what practices or patterns of antibiotic use have driven the resistance to rise so rapidly.
Thanks, Shane. So in my opinion, the biggest factor when it comes to driving antibiotic resistance and where we are now is simply lack of knowledge, right? One of the major situations that we have is the overprescription of antibiotics. Sometimes a doctor will give you antibiotic for a viral infection. Sometimes a patient will receive an antibiotic. You share it with maybe your friends. You see it a lot with less privileged communities where maybe you want to share your antibiotic or a course of your antibiotic with someone who you think has a similar infection as you. So you end up in a situation where the course of your antibiotic is not completed and your bacteria isn't fully cleared from your body or is exposed to sublethal concentrations of the antibiotic and isn't killed off completely. So this persistent exposure ends up leading to antibiotic resistance forming. Also, in addition to people not knowing how to properly use antibiotics or properly prescribe antibiotics, you also have situations where you can have poor infection control strategies in the hospital. So in hospitals, as most of us know, a lot of us will share equipment with other patients, bedding, medical devices. If this equipment isn't properly disinfected and sanitized, as we use this equipment from patient to patient, you can also carry these antimicrobial resistant bacteria from patient to patient. You can also get transmission from healthcare workers if the incorrect control measures are not being used, such as gloves or using masks. And also something that's often not recognized, especially when it comes to human clinical infections, is the contribution of the environment and of agriculture, especially when it comes to use of antibiotic in animals, because some of the antibiotics that we use for humans are either the same or very similar to those that are used to treat infections in animals, because animals also get bacterial infections, they also get viral infections, and some of these antibiotics are related. So typically in your healthcare settings, you'll find that there is a little bit more oversight when it comes to the use of antibiotics, but when it comes to the agricultural setting, there isn't much oversight. So you have a situation where people end up picking up some of these resistance, or AMR is driven in these agricultural settings.
I hope everyone is taking notes. There are a couple of really critical things that Thabo just said there. So there's a little bit of a buzzword that I'm sure a lot of the folk out there in the real world have heard, which is the word superbug. In your field, we have this buzzword, superbugs. Can you explain what they are and maybe give us an example of one of the superbugs that might be contributing to the antimicrobial resistance?
Thanks, Caitlin. It's so funny because microbiologists have a pet peeve about calling bacteria or any microorganisms bugs, but we love the word superbug because I think it gives like a nice villain effect to it. So a superbug is basically a bacteria that is resistant to multiple antibiotics. So usually when it comes to a bacterial pathogen or a bacteria that causes infections, you can have many different antibiotics that you can use to treat a bacteria that causes infection. So sometimes if the one antibiotic doesn't work, you can always try a different antibiotic to treat the infection. So a superbug is typically a bacteria that is resistant to many different antibiotics that can be used to treat that infection caused by that antibiotic. So one of the most interesting cases of a superbug in my field is that of Staphylococcus aureus, or S. aureus, as we call it in short. So methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA, is something that's currently considered to be a superbug in most countries here in the US and across the globe, basically. S. aureus was initially treated with an antibiotic called penicillin. I think a lot of you would be familiar with penicillin, which was discovered in 1928 by Alexander Fleming. In 1942, there were reports of 4 S. aureus isolates that are resistant to penicillin after penicillin was being used to treat S. aureus. And then by the 60s, there was an observed resistance of over 80% of S. aureus to penicillin. So now that a lot of these S. aureus isolates were resistant to penicillin, other antibiotics were being developed to try and treat these infections that are caused by penicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. One of these was methicillin, which is a semi-synthetic drug that was used to treat specifically penicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So it was first introduced in 1959, but then a few short years later, about 2 years later, 1961, in the UK already, there were reports of methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Now this pathogen has basically been around even up to today, from the 60s to now. It's still well known. It's well established in the community and in the hospital environments. And it's caused a lot of outbreaks in Australia, in Europe, and the United States of America. So in addition to MRSA being a superbug, now we're having another superbug that's sort of creeping up a little bit called vancomycin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So vancomycin, so initially we had penicillin, and then there was penicillin resistance. And then there was methicillin to treat penicillin-resistant S. aureus, but now we're seeing methicillin-resistant S. aureus. So now we have vancomycin that is being used to treat these methicillin-resistant S. aureus isolates. And this was introduced for MRSA treatment in the 1980s, but already by 2002, we're seeing the first VRSA strains. It is something that we're worried about. Its rates aren't as high as MRSA, but MRSA so far is like our classic superbug.
I think we also have a similar problem with tuberculosis, or TB, which is a big problem in South Africa, with what we call multi-drug and extensive drug resistance, and then total drug resistance. And I suppose people don't necessarily, people like us who we're obviously a little bit more informed because we're microbiologists, but to be honest, we're not 100% of the time as mindful, because when you're ill, you go to the doctor, you get your prescription, you don't really think about the resistance that might develop. You just want to start feeling better. But I suppose it's the same with like tuberculosis and other bacteria, but point being that you don't always realize that you might get to the point where no antibiotic is working, and then it's an overwhelming infection because it's a strong bacterium. It's totally drug resistant, and we have just grown so accustomed to going to the doctor and getting a script or a prescription for an antibiotic, and you treat the infection, and a couple of days later you feel better. But thinking around this topic and the bacteria and how they develop resistance, could we dive a little bit deeper in terms of what happens at the microbiological level when bacteria become resistant to antibiotics? Because our listeners now are very informed. I know they've listened from episode 1 up until now, and they know all about genes and DNA, etc. So I think they'd appreciate a little bit of a deeper dive into how this resistance happens at microbial level.
Thanks, Shane. Thank you very much for your DNA podcast, because that does help me quite a little bit in explaining how resistance occurs. So thanks for giving that basic understanding to everybody in that first podcast. When it comes to DNA, I'm sure a lot of your listeners are also familiar with something called mutations, right? If you don't know about mutations on DNA, when it comes to DNA, you should at least know about it when it comes to X-Men. But a lot of you would have heard of mutants and mutations. So how bacteria become resistant typically occurs generally in two main ways. When it comes to mutations, usually you have something called intrinsic resistance. So intrinsic resistance is something that's always available to the bacteria that allows like a low level baseline resistance to some antibiotics, but not all of them. When it comes to the development of mutations and AMR resistance, typically it can occur through spontaneous mutations. So spontaneous mutation is when you have a random change occur in the DNA. So a random DNA mutation, not prompted by anything. It can just randomly occur in a gene that is used to make a product of which the antibiotic targets during the killing process for treatment. This typically occurs very, very slowly. It doesn't really spread that quickly among the bacteria. But the type of mutation that most of us as microbiologists really worry about is horizontal gene transfer. Horizontal gene transfer is basically when resistance genes can be shared or transferred among bacteria. So basically, if a bacteria was previously susceptible to an antibiotic, and then it acquires this resistance gene from another resistant bacteria of a similar strain or similar species, it ends up now being resistant. So a resistance gene is a segment or piece of DNA that it basically carries the code for this antibiotic resistance genes. And then these resistant bacteria can spread these genes to non-resistant or susceptible bacteria through genetic material called plasmids, which are basically pieces of DNA that are outside of the chromosomal DNA that you discussed in your first podcast. Or it can also be spread via bacteriophages, which are viruses that can infect bacteria. Or also sometimes when a bacterial cell has died, let's say you had an antibiotic resistant bacterial cell or a bacterial cell that was carrying antibiotic resistant genes. If that cell dies and then its membrane disintegrates, sometimes you have free floating DNA kind of like hovering around in the environment. And then some bacteria that are specialized to do so are able to absorb some of that free-floating DNA and subsequently some of that DNA with antibiotic resistance genes and incorporate into their own DNA of the living bacteria. And then now that living bacteria is able to also be able to show that same kind of resistance that the dead bacteria had. So all in all, this just results in antibiotics no longer being effective. So you go from a situation where an antibiotic was able to kill a bacteria, the bacteria gained resistance genes either spontaneously or through horizontal gene transfer, and now this new bacteria is able to be resistant to antibiotics, and the treatment is no longer working.
It seems like the bacteria have to let us in on some secrets because they are a lot smarter than I thought they would be.
They have been around longer than we have, so I guess they've cracked the code somewhere. AMR is not specific to your country, your region, or the place where you live. AMR is interconnected. AMR occurs globally. There's sometimes we find that because it's almost like how we had in COVID, people move pathogens across the globe, across settings, from the hospital to their homes, from their home to the hospitals. So because of that, it was important that we had a more global approach to AMR and combating AMR. So when it comes to AMR, we try to do surveillance to make sure that we try and take note of which AMR patterns are creeping up, which antibiotics are sort of like losing resistance, which ones are problematic. We try to look at AMR in other countries because sometimes your neighbor might have a certain prevalence of a certain bacterial resistance, and then that can also affect you because the neighbors come to your house in South Africa, or you go to your neighbor's house to visit, to travel, for tourism, for whatever reason. And sometimes those bacteria can be taken back and forth. So one of the most important things was to try and make sure that we have at least a comprehensive and global approach to tackling AMR. So the way scientists try to combat AMR in South Africa is through trying to observe AMR patterns in the South African population, especially when people come to hospitals. We try to make sure that when people are resistant, we try to take note of which antibiotics they're resistant to. We try to take note of something called the prevalence as well. So we want to see if AMR resistant to antibiotic X is growing or not. And then that information is able to guide clinicians and scientists to try and figure out what is the problem. Why is antibiotic X suddenly increasing in resistance in this hospital? And then we try to now go and look at a solution as to what the cause could be for this increasing resistance. Is it maybe the fact that the antibiotic is not being used properly? Is it the fact that maybe patients are not taking it correctly? So that allows us to look for interventions. Another thing that we're trying to do as scientists nowadays is to also now monitor the genomes. So basically, we're trying to monitor all the total DNA of a bacterial cell to see if certain AMR genes are present. Because when it comes to AMR, you can have something called phenotypic AMR and also genotypic AMR, as you probably would have also been familiar with these terms in the previous podcast. So just because a bacteria carries an AMR gene, it doesn't mean that it will be expressed. So sometimes you can find, let's say, for example, like we spoke about MRSA, for example, you can have a Staphylococcus aureus isolate or bacteria cell that has genes for methicillin resistance, but not be killed by those antibiotics. Same for penicillin. You can have an isolate or a bacteria cell that has penicillin resistance genes, but is not killed by penicillin. We're not really sure always what makes a bacteria want to express or not express that resistance genes, but it is important to know, even if our antibiotics, even if our penicillin is working against S. aureus, we want to know if there is a potential for future resistance because our S. aureus isolates carry resistance genes for penicillin. So what we do when it comes to genomic surveillance, we use some very advanced techniques to try and look at all the genes that are present, especially antibiotic resistance genes that are present in a bacterial cell, so that we can see that if in our population, if the Staphylococcus aureus in our population carries penicillin resistance genes, we want to know, so because then that allows us to, even before penicillin is phenotypically expressed or before we even have an outbreak of penicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus, where the antibiotic is no longer working on the S. aureus isolate. Genomic surveillance allows us to be able to know beforehand if this could be a potential future problem and to already, before the problem even occurs, start working towards measures to try to figure out why penicillin resistance is creeping up and if there's a way that through antibiotic practice in the hospital and in the patient population, we can curb this resistance before it even occurs.
Thanks, Thabo. That's a really thorough explanation. And I think one thing we've learned through COVID or the COVID-19 pandemic is that bugs don't need visas to travel. And they travel very easily and they travel very fast and then spread in populations. So just for the listeners, if I can interject here, just as a bit of a sanity check, what Thabo was describing is that we often do what we call surveillance, where we track the spread of the pathogen, what it looks like in certain populations, and also what genes they carry, these pathogens. And those things, or the surveillance, is generally done by reference laboratories in countries where you have a huge reference laboratory. And it's a concerted effort because scientists like Thabo, who do research, also contribute by looking at specific environmental samples or clinical samples, and then they also report on those. And then that gets published in the literature, and other scientists, the government, use all of that information to make decisions because that all helps with the tracking. So speaking of the traveling and thinking of the environment, I want to ask what the role is of the environment in spreading antimicrobial resistance. But I want you to speak specifically to two terms, which I know are also hot topics at the moment. Well, the one is, we call it the One Health approach. If you can maybe just speak a little bit around that. And the other thing is animal husbandry, because we have a large farming culture and population in South Africa. And naturally, as you've alluded to earlier on, we need to treat the animals with antibiotics to make sure they don't get sick. and naturally that would land maybe in wastewater or also through consumption of animal products. So yeah, sorry, I know it could be a bit much in one go, but maybe just like the One Health approach, you could speak about animal husbandry first and then leading to this One Health approach and why that's important.
So I'm going to answer your question just with a bit of a general role of the environment, but I'll just touch on One Health after that. Typically, the environment has three major roles when it comes to AMR or AMR spread. First of all, the environment can be a source of infection, right? So you can basically get an AMR pathogen or get infected with an AMR pathogen from some of the environments. Typically, these environments that you can get these pathogens from, what they look like is that they can be contaminated with human waste or hospital waste, agricultural waste, or pharmaceutical waste. So human waste such as stools or feces or such as urine, right? So let's say maybe you're on treatment for certain microbial infection or bacterial infection. So then now if let's say you're in a community maybe where you don't have access to a flushing toilet and you might have to basically go in the outdoors, you have a situation then where you find that if maybe you are carrying a pathogen that is resistant to an antibiotic, and then you go and relieve yourself in maybe like in a river or somewhere on the soil where maybe some of that soil can end up seeping into maybe a river or can end up being transferred to other areas where people can come into contact with this kind of water. Then you end up with a situation where you can get some of these infections from contaminated water due to people who have these infections or AMR infections depositing some of their waste into these environmental settings. Also, when it comes to the environment, I think one of the places where a lot of countries, especially low to middle income countries, fail is when it comes to the sewage system. So sometimes you end up finding some waste, clinical waste, agricultural waste, pharmaceutical waste. It ends up basically getting all dumped together or finding its way into places like rivers or into soil or into air. So then this now becomes a source of infection. So because you now have all these different types of waste, right? So you have the humans and the agricultural waste from your animals, which have the bacteria, right? And then now you also have hospital waste, which has human bacterial waste. So bacteria with AMR pathogens from human waste of hospital patients can end up in these environments. But also, you also have in the hospital waste, basically waste that has higher than normal or higher than your average of antibiotics present in that waste because a lot of these people are under treatment already. Same with agricultural waste. Sometimes some of these antibiotics are used as growth promoters or are used as treatment in your animals. So these also end up sometimes in rivers or in soil environments or in air. So, and then when also pharmaceutical waste in some instances, not just from the companies, but also from us as human beings. Sometimes, I don't know, sometimes you get given your antibiotics, you feel like you're feeling a little bit better, or you have old antibiotics that you were once given and you never used, you got better, they're kind of lying around, you want to get rid of them, and maybe just chuck them in the river. That also now creates a situation where you have antibiotics now in contact with some of these bacteria or some of these resistant bacteria. So now your water becomes what is called a hotspot, right? So you have all these factors. You have your bacteria, you have bacterial resistance genes, you have antibiotics that are at concentrations that are not strong enough to kill them, that end up now being in the same environment. So this becomes a hotspot for antimicrobial resistance to develop because now you kind of like force the bacteria to take up some of these antibiotic resistance genes if they want to survive in this environment, or to share these genes if they want to survive in this environment. And that's how sometimes the environment can end up contributing to AMR or being a source of AMR infection. Also, the environment is quite mobile. If you look at water, for example, water doesn't stay still in one spot, unless it's a pond. But usually if you have something like a river, even if you dump all these different kinds of waste in this specific spot, it moves, right? So you can find that just because you're contamination at one spot, once you contaminate that source of water, it can end up moving to different parts of the country, different parts of the province through that water channel. So another major role of the environment is it moves resistance. So if maybe people in area X having high levels of resistance, you can find that people in area Y are also affected because the water that is contaminated from that area moves to the areas as well. And then the whole loop begins again. It's a hot spot for people in the area in the secondary area. They can also get infected from this water. One Health. What is One Health? So One Health is something that is now widely spoken about by scientists. So One Health is an approach that recognizes the interconnectedness of humans, animals, plants, and their shared environment when it comes to the development of AMR and its spread, right? So like I was saying earlier, you can get AMR in the hospital, for example, right? And then you can end up carrying some of those AMR pathogens to your community. And people in your community can also end up acquiring some of these AMR pathogens from you. You'll have a situation where farmers who maybe don't use antibiotics in the correct manner end up driving antimicrobial resistance to, let's say, S. aureus, for example. If maybe a certain antibiotic is used against S. aureus, human beings can also get S. aureus infections. So sometimes you find that the people who are handling those animals, or even just from some of these pathogens being emitted into the environment, you end up with a situation where even we as human beings can get AMR pathogens from the animals, or farm workers can get AMR pathogens from the animals that they handle, and then share those pathogens with their family members, even if they've never been anywhere near a farm. Or also, sometimes they can even bring those pathogens into the hospital environment, because let's say you get an infection from one of the animals as a farm worker, and then it's bad enough that you need to be hospitalized, and then suddenly you bring that pathogen, that specific AMR resistant strain, into the hospital, and then also you spread it into that environment. So what a lot of scientists and a lot of very clever people around the world in the science arena decided was that we need a comprehensive approach that brings all these factors together: humans, animals, plant, environment, to bring them all together and try and tackle antimicrobial resistance from all of these factors, and not just look at one factor, because you end up putting out one fire, but then you have 3 other fires going as well. So One Health will use interdisciplinary skills. So you basically get a lot of clever people from many different environments. You get policymakers, you get veterinarians, you get clinicians, hospital workers, you get scientists like myself, you get people who are in the food industry. So all of these people will come together to try and see how we can combat antimicrobial resistance in this holistic approach. So that's basically what we call One Health. So we'll use their skills to be able to combat zoonotic diseases. So these are diseases that can transfer from animals to humans, to combat AMR driven by human and veterinary antibiotic misuse, and also environmental health to tackle contamination with AMR bacteria. And this subsequently also benefits us by ensuring food safety and security, so that even outside of us as human beings needing to have our infections treated, even animals that are treated with antibiotics, they'll still be effective. That ensures food security for us.
I think one of the biggest eye-openers about these podcasts and getting such amazing scientists like you, Thabo, on this platform with us is realizing how little we actually know. Like, you don't know what you don't know. And it's such a huge invisible threat that no one is really aware of, or very few people are aware of. Now, we've covered a lot of the breakdown of the sciencey stuff. So we always like to bring it back just to the everyday application of these. So can you explain to us what does AMR actually mean for people on the everyday front? So for example, if I have to get a common infection in 10 years from now, do you think the treatment might differ? Do you think AMR is going to have an effect on that?
That's a very complex question, because a lot of it depends on behavior, right? And what we do in the meantime. It also depends on where you are, actually, because if you're in an environment or an area where there is oversight of antibiotic use, where there is education around antibiotic use, then there is hope. So with MRSA, for example, South Africa has seen a decline in MRSA prevalence in the last decade or so. And a lot of this can be attributed to improved antibiotic stewardship programs and also better surveillance. So in 10 years, it just depends on the antibiotic. It depends on the bacteria, and also depends on the strategies that are in place. So it is possible to combat AMR, but it does require quite a bit of effort. And all of us are responsible for tackling AMR. So not just for the scientists, even you as a patient can contribute to combating AMR.
Remember, kids, finish your course of antibiotics, drink it only when it's necessary, listen to your doctor's instructions, take responsibility.
They say kids don't do drugs, but when it comes to these drugs, that are given to you by a doctor to treat microbial infections, please do them.
On the same tangent, what are the promising strategies to slow or stop AMR? You've alluded to some of it, and I suppose I'll bundle a couple of my thoughts into one idea. If you could maybe touch on the strategies, which might also include like public education in how people use antibiotics and how doctors, like general practitioners, for example, prescribe these antibiotics.
So in my opinion, I think the most important is education. A lot of times antibiotics aren't prescribed correctly or used correctly because people just don't know, or they're just not aware of what you can or cannot do, or what the consequences are of not finishing your antibiotics or giving antibiotics for a viral infection. So education is the most important thing. Educational programs that teach the community, that teach even healthcare professionals like doctors on the responsible use of antimicrobials. Don't pressure your doctor into giving you an antibiotic. I know sometimes some patients will go into the doctor's office, and unless the doctor gives them an antibiotic or some kind of treatment, they feel like they haven't been like properly consulted or properly attended to. So please don't try and pressure or try and push your doctor to give you an antibiotic if they feel like they don't have to give you one. Something else is vaccination. I know it's become surprisingly controversial over the years, but vaccines do work. And vaccines are different from antibiotics, right? But vaccines do support combating AMR resistance in that if you have a vaccination against a certain bacterial pathogen, then the likelihood of you being infected with that pathogen goes down. So the likelihood of you needing to get an antibiotic to treat an infection caused by that pathogen also goes down. So then you basically reduce the number and the amount of antibiotics that are being used and exposure of bacteria to antibiotic infections. So vaccinations are very important. AMR surveillance, as we said earlier on, in hospitals, in communities, in the country, globally, to track these AMR pathogens is very important to combat AMR because it allows us to be prepared and to know what we're dealing with. And then also drug development, the development of new antibiotics, it does occur. So scientists are trying to find new targets for antibiotics or to repurpose existing ones or to modify existing antibiotics, which we've seen resistance in, to modify them, to make them better able to work and overcome that resistance. Unfortunately, when it comes to drug development, it's very, very slow, doesn't go as quickly as resistance occurs. And also, like we saw with my early example of penicillin, methicillin, and vancomycin, when it comes to Staphylococcus aureus, bacteria are very clever and they've been at this game for a long, long time. And they've been with us for a while because even some studies have found that MRSA in some of these like prehistoric ice glaciers from the millions of years ago. So it is important to know that when it comes to drug development, it's a back and forth game. So we can't always rely on the fact that new drugs are coming. New drugs aren't coming as quickly as antibiotic resistance is occurring. And when these new drugs are developed, there's always a possibility that the bacteria will develop antibiotic resistance to this antibiotic. Generally, when it comes to the everyday person, right? So AMR is not just a problem or something that can be solved just by healthcare workers like your doctors or your nurses, or just by scientists like myself. Everybody has a responsibility when it comes to AMR, and everybody is able to affect change when it comes to AMR. So some of it goes back to your preschool days, like wash your hands, right? Washing your hands does help you to physically wash off any contamination with AMR or bacteria on your hands. Wash your hands before eating, before handling somebody who might be sick. Yeah, just keep your hands clean. If you're a doctor, if you're a kid, if you're a nurse, if you're whatever you do, whatever profession you're in, just make sure that you wash your hands. Stay home when you're sick, especially if you have like a very serious infection, because we can spread bacteria to people who are not sick around us. So stay home when you're sick. Only take your antibiotics when prescribed. Make sure you finish your antibiotics. Don't share your antibiotics. And if you have leftover antibiotics or you have antibiotics that expired, just ask your doctor or your pharmacist how you can get rid of them if you want to get rid of them. Don't just flush them down the toilet or just throw them randomly in the environment. Speak to your doctor and ask them to help you get rid of your antibiotics.
And that's what we call antibiotic or antimicrobial stewardship, right? Where we take care in every aspect when it comes to antibiotics, whether it's antibiotics that we're like consuming or taking that doctor has prescribed or whichever way. And it's just that stewardship and taking great care and looking after that, and also the microbes that might be affected by that.
We're going to ask you one more, slightly more technical question before we go into the more personal side of it. If we have to take a look 20 to 30 years into the future, do you feel more optimistic or more worried about how we're going to be dealing with AMR?
I'd say both. Like I previously just mentioned, so the possibilities are there, right? We can tackle AMR. It's not something that's just going to happen to us and there's nothing we can do about it. We can tackle AMR, but how we tackle AMR is dependent on what everybody who's able to contribute does, right? So 20 to 30 years from now, most likely it'll still be there. You never get rid of AMR completely because bacteria are always finding ways to overcome antimicrobial resistance. But if we are vigilant when it comes to antibiotic stewardship, when it comes to surveillance, when it comes to education, if we put more efforts towards finding newer antibiotics and developing them, if we put more efforts in towards creating measures towards surveillance and monitoring of antibiotics in the agricultural and environmental settings, because from what I understand, currently there isn't like a proper antibiotic surveillance system in South Africa when it comes to the use of antibiotics in the agricultural field, especially for the small farmers. So when it comes to us trying to look at all those checkpoints and trying to make sure that as best as we can, that we are managing AMR in those different areas, there is a possibility of us tackling AMR or at least reducing the severity of AMR in South Africa, globally as well, depending on how the countries respond to AMR.
I hope you guys are all paying attention. We all are responsible for this. So please, we've covered everything you need to do. Take notes. Okay, let's close this off on a good note. If you could send one clear message about antimicrobial resistance to our listeners, what would it be?
Do the drugs your doctor tells you to. AMR is everybody's responsibility. It's not just your doctor's responsibility, it's yours as well. Play your part. You are responsible. If you're a healthcare worker, if you're a farmer, if you're a patient, if you know a healthcare worker, a farmer or a patient, after listening to this podcast, ask them what they know about AMR. If maybe someone that you know is a farmer, ask them how do they dispose of their antibiotics? How do they go about treating the pathogen, the infections in their animals, and share some of the knowledge that you have learned here with people in your life. Share knowledge, educate yourself, and make sure that you do your part when it comes to tackling AMR.
And act responsibly. For me, it always comes back to, I always think about the day when there's literally no effective treatment for whatever disease or condition me or one of my loved ones might have, and AMR or antimicrobial usage practices that might have led to that point. And that would be a very devastating point for me. When you're hospitalized, you've got an infection. I mean, people still, we've spoken about it. People still die of that or in that way. But I always fear for that. And I don't know if it's an irrational fear because I'm a microbiologist, so I might overthink it a little bit. But I mean, it is a real threat. So that's always, always try and make it a little bit more personal. And then for me personally, I act a little bit more responsibly. Yeah, that's always my way of just keeping myself accountable.
So yeah, Shane, what you're saying is very important, and it is a very real threat, not just because you're a microbiologist. We are looking at a danger around entering something called a pre-antibiotic era. So this is basically the time before antibiotics were even discovered. So a lot of people would die from small infections because there were no antibiotics to treat, and a lot of people will be dying in large numbers to things that are preventable. So AMR can take us back there if we're not careful and find ourselves in the pre-antibiotic era, where even in the future, people might be dying from very simple infections by today's standards. But because now these bacteria are resistant to antimicrobials, we end up not being able to treat them and people are dying, losing their loved ones from very, very simple infections.
Thank you for that. And thank you for the reminder and sharing your knowledge. And even though the contribution that you bring to humanity might seem small, hint, hint, bacteria, they're very small. We know it's a really big contribution, and a whole lot of time and effort and knowledge and expertise goes into that. So thank you for the fight against antimicrobial resistance, and also sharing your knowledge and coming onto the podcast. It's really nice to talk to you. It was very informative for me as a microbiologist myself. I mean, there are some things that I've kind of forgotten and some things I didn't know to the detail, but yeah, very informative. And we are hoping to have you sometime in the future again when we deal with a new threat or a new topic on antimicrobial resistance. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jane. I appreciate you and appreciate both you and Caitlin for the opportunity to share. Because like I said previously, education is important when it comes to combating AMR. So I thank you for extending this platform for me to be able to speak about AMR and also to educate your listeners on AMR.
Thank you so much, Thabo, for coming and speaking to us. If any of our listeners have got some questions for Thabo, if you guys want to ask any questions regarding antimicrobial resistance or anything else that might interest you, please feel free to pose your questions on the website, as we normally do, or on any of our social medias. We will link Thabo's LinkedIn profile. So if you would like to check out what she's doing, then you have access to that. We're going to wrap this up and call it a day. And thanks again for listening to Science on the Table.